So, I thought it would be useful to make a little tutorial, mostly going over Steve's Factory Manager, the majority of the blocks and the functions, and trying to put some of it in a bit of a New Horizons context, specifically like case uses for it, how to make these actually do stuff for you, places in which this will save your life, and a whole bunch of others. So, first of all, whenever you open up your inventory for the first time, it'll be completely blank, and the first thing that you're going to want to do is make a trigger. You'll see here I have a trigger, default 1. These don't actually let you put it below 1 second. While you can do it in some ways, it's mostly advised you keep it around 1 for TPS issues. You'll see there's a couple ways to have your trigger work, and we'll go over these later on. Delayed trigger is something added by Steve's add-ons and is a little buggy. Now, you'll see that next, right after this, there's a flow. Flow is very simple. You tell it how many inputs or outputs you want, tell it how to split them, and it uses a little split to kind of distribute your trigger among everything that you want to run. So the first thing that we're going to do here is a simple item move. This will go over all of the item-based commands, which are item conditions, inputs, and outputs. Now, conditions let you check an inventory in a direction for any amount of items. You can use requires all to need all of them. You can say if they just have some. And if you right-click, you get a lot of other options. You get this down here, which will let you use damage values, NBT values, disable NBT values, or dictionary, simply mod detection, and match all. This will count as every item. So this will give a true command if there is any item within the chest. So as I have set up right now, in this steel chest, if there is any item, do nothing. If there is no item, input from the crystal chest, specifically tiny copper piles. Then output them into the steel chest, no whitelist. Now, one thing to note about this, if you try to find tiny copper dust, you actually won't be able to find it. It's not in the search. So what you're going to have to do is find your copper dust, look for a recipe. You'll see that when looking at the this is annealed copper. When looking at copper dust, the ID tag for it is the same initial tag as copper, but ends in 35 instead of 2035. So if we go in here and we put copper dust, and we edit the damage value from 2035 to 35, we now have tiny copper. This is used for tiny piles, I believe, ores, and a handful of other gregtech items that simply just don't appear when you search for them. Now, we go ahead, and we try to run our command. Well, we have it so if there's an item in here, it won't move anything. But you'll see in here there's many items as well as some tiny piles. So if we get rid of this snow, it will move over the tiny piles right away. All the levers will stay because we don't filter for them, and we get our tiny piles. You can use item movement for things such as processing arrays, in which you want to have many different screwdriver separate hatches. It makes it kind of easy to simply input and output, especially if you aren't using any type of pattern inside there, like a mold or a shape. It's very easy. You can use simple item conditions, check if the hatch is items, then input from AE, output. Very easy. Now, moving on to fluids, we'll see that they actually behave very similar to items. Once again, we get conditions, inputs, and outputs. Now, one downside of fluids is we don't get a lot of specificity in the conditions. So when filtering for fluids, we can do quantities and we can do fluids, but we can't do any other editing to it. This means that we don't have a simple "is there a fluid in here" check, which can get a little complicated down the line. But anyway, from here we just are checking the input hatch. Does it have water? If so, if not, input from the tank, output to the hatch. Now, one more thing when it comes to hatches specifically, as well as a couple other GT items, you actually can only input from the face that has this little box. So for that we need, even for the condition, we need to check the target and make sure the target is the same direction that this is facing. In this case it is west, as Wayla says, so I have these all set to west. Now if I go ahead and I plunger out all of this water, we will see that it moves all of it right over. Just like that, we now have all of our water. The main applications of this are doing things such as LCR automation. You can pull from a whole set of inventories and then push to a hatch and use that to craft many recipes in the same LCR, because you can avoid fluid overlaps. Now moving on, we have redstone. Very simple, almost simpler than items. We have the receiver, and we have the emitter. Basically, receivers can detect signals of any strength on any side, and emitters can output signals to any side at any strength. They can also pulse on command, and for the most part, that's about what you're going to be using them for. As you see here, I simply check for the one of the levers, then I toggle one of the sides of the emitter for it, then I check if they're both on, and I toggle both emitters. Here, I say if one of the levers isn't on, is the other one on? If so, toggle emitter. If not, set all the outputs to 0. So, one more thing, these emitters are set to pulse. So you will see a little bit of a difference when I hold down a lever, as that pulses, versus doing this, in which they'll both be on. Great. Now, moving on, we have inventory relays, as well as the alternative options of triggers. So, as you'll see, these aren't actually connected in the group, and that's because I've given them each a unique trigger. Now, these aren't normal triggers. You'll see they have quite a lot of options on the bottom, but in fact, this one is set to redstone, and this one is set to a bud switch, essentially. Now, the redstone, simply I check the inventory, I check for a signal. If there's a signal, I will do a command. This one here checks for a block update, but specifically needs to be a block update of a block of diamond. Then it will also run some commands. Now, if we go here and we pull this lever, we will find that the main inventory relay is kind of useless. You can put an item in here, and when on, it will occasionally output items to the inventory relay. I have personally had some issues with this in the past, but there we go. You see when it is on, it will push items into it. The way I had it before, you can switch it, it can pull items out of it. I've yet to really find a use for this, mostly because you could just put a cable on whatever inventory it is instead and use commands, but I guess there has to be some use for it. Now, the advanced version is actually a lot more useful. It has somewhat of some commands or uses I could see on New Horizons. You'll see in this case I actually have it to pull my entire inventory into this chest. So on block update, we'll see, it all got pulled in there. Now, I've personally only used this once. I can see some uses in some other cases. My main thing is that we do have better inventory access. Open blocks and random things both have much better inventories that are entirely wireless, actually. And for this one, you need to stand on it. However, I did one time use this to fill up my inventory with ender pearls very fast while I filled a charm of dislocation. I just sat next to my mob farm, stood on this, and spam shift click, and it wasn't the worst. Now, moving on, we have crafting. That's going to be using these auto crafting values. You'll see this redstone condition is simply to check a lever here. We then input from our input chest, in this case a drawer with infinite buckets. We use the crafting command to craft fresh water. We tell it if there's extra items, put it in the gold chest, and then output to the gold chest. For this recipe, this excess will be for things like the buckets. Now if I go here and I click this lever, we will see fresh water starting to be crafted. Now the downside to this is that it will only do one craft per iteration, and crafts are going to be limited to about 1 second in time, so it's definitely not the fastest autocrafter, and it's definitely not the most convenient autocrafter, but every once in a while there's somewhat of a use for it. If you have tiny piles that are coming out of something and you want to put them into a full pile, or if you want to export your copper dust to your PVI setup, or zinc, sorry, there's some very small use, but for the most part I would suggest avoiding the crafter. It is prone to some lag issues, and as crafting goes, we have much better. Now moving on, we have item valves. These are kind of interesting items in what they do. They are essentially a much better dispenser combined with a pretty shitty essentially item vacuum. They're almost like vacuum hoppers. They're better in a sense, but their range is awful. So once again, I have some levers set up to toggle this. If we go here, this lever, when I put an item in here, it will shoot it out. Basically just a dispenser. Now this feature, I would say, doesn't have a ton of use. I should actually explain this. The way that you do it is simply input from either the chest into the valve to shoot it, or for our next option, you will see you input from the valve into the chest. Anyway, one use I can see for these, not necessarily unique to this, I believe you can use dispensers as well, but witchery brew automation. You need to throw a bunch of stuff into a cauldron. I believe also some ritual automation is possible. I'm not exactly sure if it's needed. I haven't done a ton of witchery, but similarly, you could throw things on the ground and click a chalk with a different block, but this would be able to drop stuff for you. Now, you'll see here we have a second option for it, which is if we throw an item in the world, it will actually pick it up. I guess sometimes the normal valves don't always pick them up as well. However, if we use the advanced, or the rapid item valve, sorry, it's very similar to the draconic magnet, in which when you throw something, like right away, it is snagged. So that's how that works. I will say the sad part though is the range is about 3 blocks. So you'll see right here doing great. Come out here, oh, and suddenly we can throw blocks on the ground. So for that, random things does seem to beat it by quite a lot. At I think it's a 12 radius in every direction, but the shooting aspect of these does definitely have some use when it comes to witchery brews. Now, moving on, one of our last actual block type items, we have the block gate. Now, this is a weird item. It's almost like if you took a block breaker and a block placer and put them into one block. Here we have a set of conduits that will pull out of it and input into here, and you will see that that will go ahead and just completely break the block, and it ends up in this chest. If we were to break something a lot more fun, like a gregtech block, you'll see that it actually picks it up, which is somewhat unique for something that's essentially breaking things. It will get dirt from grass, but it will actually get an advanced or any GT machine. Now, the other option for this is you can feed it blocks, and you will see that it will, in fact, place them. If it doesn't have the ability to place them, you'll see it'll actually just go ahead and drop them in the world. Now, this has some uses. You can use it to break things like redstone or red lily crops, red lions. You can use it to place some things if you need to. I could see some super fun, like open computers based things to actually move these around and use them to place a bunch of items and like build things. But for the moment, they aren't super useful to you. You can use them for cobble gens, but we don't really need that here. Now, our second to last actual cable block is going to be the Sine Updater. Now, you will see that there's a sign here giving us a friendly little hello, and we have a lever. So if we go ahead and pull this, I wonder what wisdom we get. Wow, look at that. That's some woke counsel right there. Now, our final block is actually quite a little stealthy ninja. It's been here the whole time. It's why the grass blocks look like they completely lost color on top for some reason. Our final block here is the Camo Block. You'll see if I go ahead and I disable this. Oop. That's not how you do that. Sorry. If I go in and I tell these to clear the camo, they turn back into their camo blocks. Now, you'll see looking at it, though, they aren't quite camo blocks. They're called advanced cable clusters. That is one of the somewhat expensive blocks from SFM, and this is used to specifically store multiple cables inside of it, while also being able to function as an inventory cable. What I mean by that is if I put something like, let's say I put an item valve down here, this manager would still be able to access it even though there's no inventory cable running to it. That's because you can put them in the advanced cable cluster. However, if you use the normal cable cluster, you'll still be able to do camos and such, but you won't be able to run signals. The camo block doesn't actually really have any use. I used it back in my old base to signify what fluid was in my EBFs for aesthetically fun reasons, but it's pretty much a useless feature outside of just fun creations. The cluster, though, I will say does have some use, but isn't terribly useful because we don't really need it for anything besides fun stuff like this. Now, the last thing I'm going to go over is somewhat complicated compared to the rest, but this is going to be the variables as well as the for loops. And this should round out pretty much everything in here. Now, the basic idea of variables is super simple. You give it a color, you tell it if it's global or local, and what you're going to do is assign inventories to that variable. All that means if you go into, let's say, an input command, ooh, messed up there. If you go to show your variables, you can say, oh, I want to input from the input variable. I don't want to select all my chests. Now, this is particularly useful if you're doing something like SFM and have an input, or sorry, the assembly line. It also is pretty useful with LCRs, just because your fluid network can get pretty large, and it's easier to not have to search through, define every inventory you pull from, and this way you can simply tell it it's in this variable. The other huge upside to variables is if I go, let's say, and I break this block right here, normally that would take this off of the network, which if it was in an input would completely void what's set here. However, if you use variables, all it's going to do is remove it from the variable. So fixing stuff when you break a cable is as easy as just re-adding it to your variable. When you have tons and tons of commands behind tons of groups, that can be a huge, huge help. Now, I have two other variables. This one will make a lot of sense. It's the output, and it's simply all of my output chests. Now I have another one here which is called fake output, and actually doesn't have any inventories. This is what's used in the for loops. So you'll see here, in my first variable here, I use my outputs, and in the second, I use my fake outputs. Loop order, I'm personally a fan of cable order, mostly because I'm not entirely sure of the standard ordering system, and I find this easier because I know this will be 1, this will be 2, and so on. Now, this here, the output is what will happen once all of this is done. This is everything inside of this for each is done, and it continues. Now, the for each is where it gets interesting. What it kind of does is it will take an output chest. For example, this chest here is part of output. It will assign it to the variable fake output. Then anything I run here on fake output will be individually ran sequentially on each one of these. Now what that means is a lot of things. I personally find this to be a very useful way of moving a lot of items between ordered chests. So for example, let's say I had a chest like that, one here, and one here. If I wanted to move from chest 1 to chest 1, chest 2 to chest 2, and so on, which is incredibly useful with assembly lines, what I would be able to do is say for each, and then I would say input chest that has an item, check if the output chest has an item, and if so, pull from the fake input variable, and then output to the fake output variable. In this case, all I'm doing is I'm checking if the assigned fake output variable has an item, and if not, then I am putting 16 redstone in. What that means is if I go ahead and I throw 64 in here, we'll see it gets equally split up among all of them. Now if I go ahead and I throw any more redstone in here, we'll actually see that nothing happens because each of them has an item already in them. However, if I go ahead and I pull any of them out, you'll see it gets filled up right away. Normally this would be a lot harder to do than just these simple commands, because you would have to filter for if each one of these is full. However, this way we can use a very simple for each command, and as long as they all need the same function, it lets us bunch all of this together. So, I hope this was somewhat enlightening if you haven't used a ton of Steve's Factory Manager. I will say it is a very powerful tool. If you're just running a ton of single block automation, it's kind of even useful for that. Combining many recipes and LCRs without input overlap, it can do pretty well. The 1 second delay will eventually come to be something that you despise. However, there's ways around it. Anyway, I do hope that this helped at least some people, and I hope that you do enjoy using SFM. It's a very fun mod, and it should let your GTNH playthrough be maybe just a little bit easier.